The call came on a Tuesday morning in early November, while I was standing at the kitchen counter cutting up a butternut squash for soup. I'd had the phone wedged between my ear and my shoulder, the way I always do when I'm cooking, and for a moment I thought I'd heard my son wrong. "We're doing Thanksgiving at Crystal's parents' place this year," he said. "Just the four of us. You know, our little unit." Our little unit. I set the knife down on the cutting board. "Of course," I said. "That sounds nice." "You're not upset, are you, Mom?" "No, sweetheart, you go enjoy yourselves." He sounded relieved. The way people sound when they've been rehearsing something and it goes smoother than expected. He said goodbye and hung up, and the kitchen went so quiet I could hear the refrigerator hum. I looked at the squash on the cutting board. I had bought 4 of them because that's how many I always roasted for Thanksgiving. 1 for the soup, 1 for the casserole, 2 to send home with my son and daughter-in-law in a dish I'd never see returned. I looked at all 4 of them sitting there on the counter, and something cold moved through me. Not sadness exactly. Something quieter and colder than that. My husband, Ron, passed 9 years ago. Pancreatic cancer, fast and brutal. 8 weeks from diagnosis to the morning I sat beside him in a hospital room in Nashville and watched him take his last breath. He was 61 years old. He'd been wearing his old cardigan, the brown one with the missing button that I kept meaning to sew back on. I never did sew it back on. I still have the button in a little dish on my dresser. After Ron died, I reorganized my whole life around the shape of what was left. My work, my garden, my church, and my son. My son was 34 when his father passed. He and Crystal had just had Mason, their first, and Zoe came 2 years later. I watched both of them come into the world. I was the first one to hold Zoe after Crystal. Before they even handed her to her father, she looked up at me with those dark, unfocused eyes, and I thought, this is it. This is the reason you keep going. For 9 years, I have been the one who keeps going. I drove 40 minutes each way, every Tuesday and Thursday, to pick Mason and Zoe up from school when Crystal's work schedule changed. I sat in that car for 3 years, Tuesdays and Thursdays, with a box of goldfish crackers in the glove compartment because Mason wouldn't eat anything else after school. I paid for Zoe's piano lessons, $200 a month, and I never once mentioned it unless someone asked, and nobody ever asked. I knitted both children their Christmas stockings the first year they were born, sitting up late at the kitchen table. After my son and daughter-in-law had gone to bed, working by the light of the small lamp because I didn't want to wake anyone. When they bought their house 6 years ago, that pretty craftsman on Sycamore with the big porch, I wrote a check for $35,000 toward the down payment. I took it from the savings account Ron and I had built together over 23 years of marriage, the one we'd always said was for emergencies. I signed my name on the check and handed it to my son across this same kitchen table, and he said, "We'll pay you back, Mom." I said, "I know you will." Neither of us said anything else about it. I have never asked for that money back. I was not a woman who kept score. I want to be clear about that. I did those things because I loved them. Because my son was my child, and those grandchildren were pieces of my heart walking around in little sneakers. Because after Ron died, and the house got so quiet, I started leaving the television on just to have another voice in the room. The only thing that made the quiet bearable was being needed. Being useful. Driving up to Sycamore on a Tuesday afternoon and finding Mason waiting by the front window with his backpack already on. That was worth more than I can say. But somewhere along the way, I had confused being needed with being wanted. And those are not the same thing at all. I noticed it in small ways. The way you notice a draft under a door. Not all at once, but gradually, until one day you realize you've been cold for a long time. My daughter-in-law had stopped asking for my recipe 2 or 3 years back, though she still served the dishes I'd taught her at holiday meals. The invitations to Sunday dinner had slowed, and then stopped without anyone announcing it. When I visited, I started to feel like a service call. Someone who showed up, performed a function, and was expected to leave before the evening settled in. Last Thanksgiving, I had been the one to cook the entire meal. I brought it all in aluminum pans in the back of my car. The turkey, the dressing, the green bean casserole, the cranberry salad, the rolls I'd gotten up at 5 in the morning to bake. Crystal had set the table in her signature style. Linen napkins, the good china she'd inherited from her grandmother, candles that smelled like cedar and clove. It was beautiful. I put my aluminum pans on the counter, and they looked out of place in a way that made my chest tighten. After dinner, I helped clean up. That part I remember clearly because Mason was in the other room with his father watching football, and Crystal was sitting on the couch looking at her phone, and I was alone in the kitchen with a dish towel and 5 pans in the particular silence of someone working in a house where nobody thinks to come check on them. I found an old photograph last spring, one I'd never really looked at before. It was from Thanksgiving 7 years ago, and at first I thought it was a picture of my son and daughter-in-law and baby Mason at the table, laughing at something. And then I looked again, and there I was, at the edge of the frame, slightly out of focus, carrying a serving dish back toward the kitchen. You could see the shape of me, the blur of motion, not sitting at the table, moving through it like a ghost. I stood in my living room and looked at that photograph for a long time. I had driven 40 minutes each way every Tuesday and Thursday. I had written a check for $35,000. I had gotten up at 5 in the morning to bake rolls, and I was so far to the edge of the frame I was almost gone. In November, after my son's call, I went to the grocery store anyway. Some part of me still operates on a kind of autopilot that knows what the holidays are supposed to look like and moves toward them regardless. I put a 14-pound turkey in my cart. I picked up sweet potatoes and celery and a bag of the good pecans from the bin, not the pre-packaged ones. I bought heavy cream and fresh sage and 2 kinds of cranberries. I came home and set everything on the counter and stood there looking at it for a long time. Then I put the cream and the turkey in the refrigerator and the rest in the pantry and went to sit in the living room. Ron's chair was still there. I've never moved it. It's a wingback, dark green, the fabric worn soft on both armrests. I don't sit in it, but I don't move it either. I sat on the couch instead, pulled the quilt from the back of it around my shoulders, and looked at the chair. "What would you have done?" I asked him, out loud. I do that sometimes. 9 years out, and I still talk to Ron when the house gets too quiet. He doesn't answer, of course, but sometimes the question is what matters, not the answer. He would have seen it sooner than I did. That was always his way. He had a quality I never quite developed, the ability to see people as they were rather than as he needed them to be. He loved our son, but he was clear-eyed about him in a way I never could manage. Once, when our son was in his 20s and had borrowed money for the second time without paying back the first, Ron said to me, quietly over dinner, "He's a good boy, but you have to stop making it so easy for him to take you for granted." I told him he was being too hard. I told him the boy would grow out of it. That was 20 years ago. I thought about Zoe's piano lessons. $200 a month, every month for 3 years. My son and daughter-in-law knew I paid for them. I had started paying when they'd mentioned that lessons were expensive and they might have to stop. I offered before they could ask. I always offered before they could ask. That was my mistake. I see it now. When you volunteer, people don't have to value it. It becomes the air, invisible, expected, taken for granted until the moment it stops. I called the piano teacher the next morning, a kind woman who drove over from Murfreesboro twice a week. I told her I was going to need to stop the payments after December. And I explained, as gently as I could, that I was making some changes in my personal finances. She understood. She said, Zoe was talented and she hoped they'd find another way to keep her going. I said I hoped so too. Then I called my attorney. Her office was warm and smelled like coffee, and she sat across from me and listened with the particular attention of someone who has heard many versions of this same story and does not judge any of them. I told her what I wanted to do. I wanted to revise my will. I wanted to reduce my son's direct inheritance and redirect the larger portion to the Children's Literacy Foundation at the public library in town. The one I'd volunteered with for 11 years. The one that handed out free books every summer to kids who didn't have any. I wanted the change made immediately, and I wanted it done quietly. She asked me if I was sure. I told her I had never been more sure of anything since the day I signed my name on Ron's death certificate. She nodded and started taking notes. I drove home in the November gray and sat in my driveway for a few minutes before I went inside. I wasn't angry. I want to be precise about this because it matters. I was not acting out of anger. Anger is hot and impulsive and gone by morning. What I felt was something much steadier and colder. A clarity that had been building for years behind all the busyness, behind all the driving, and the writing of checks and the baking of rolls at 5 in the morning. The clarity of a woman who finally stopped looking away. Thanksgiving came the way it always does in Tennessee. Gray sky, cold snap, the smell of wood smoke from the neighbors' chimneys. I woke up early, as I always do. Old habit. My body doesn't know how to sleep past 6 regardless of what the day holds. I made coffee and sat at the kitchen table. Outside, the maple in the front yard had gone fully bare, its branches making dark lace against the pale sky. I remembered the year. Ron and our young son had raked all the leaves from that tree into an enormous pile and let the boy dive into it about 16 times until the pile was nothing but scattered leaves across the lawn. Ron had laughed until his eyes watered. I had watched from this same window with a mug of coffee in my hands, exactly like this. I didn't cook the turkey, I moved it to the freezer. What I did instead was bake 2 loaves of banana bread. The recipe I've had since 1987, handwritten and an index card that's gone soft at the corners from being handled so many times. Banana bread is simple and honest and makes the whole house smell like warmth. I made 2 loaves because one of them was always going to be for Joyce. Joyce lives 3 houses down. She moved in about 4 years ago after a hard divorce with her daughter Sadie, who was 4 years old at the time, and used to stand at the edge of their yard watching me garden with an expression of such pure, solemn interest that it made me smile every single time. Joyce worked long hours. She was a nurse, on rotating shifts, and there were times I could see the tiredness in her face from across the fence. We'd started talking over that fence the summer she's moved in. She brought me tomatoes from her garden. I brought her zucchini bread. We understood each other without having to say very much. I wrapped one of the loaves in foil and walked it down the street. The cold air was sharp and clean, and the sky had that flat white quality that means snow is thinking about it. Sadie answered the door. She was 8 now, wearing mismatched socks and a fleece pullover with a horse on it, and when she saw me and then looked at the foil package in my hands, her whole face changed. "Is that banana bread?" she said. "It is," I said. "Mom," she yelled, turning back into the house. "Miss Roberta brought banana bread." Joyce appeared from the kitchen with a dish towel over her shoulder, and when she saw me, something shifted in her face. Not surprise exactly, but something soft and real. "Come in," she said. "Please, come in." I had not planned on going in, but I went in. Their house was small and warm and cluttered in the comfortable way that houses with children are cluttered. A backpack dropped in the hallway. Sadie's drawings taped to the refrigerator. A half-finished puzzle on the coffee table. It looked like a house where people actually lived. I sat at Joyce's kitchen table and she poured me a cup of coffee without asking if I wanted one. And Sadie sat across from me and asked, very seriously, whether I'd ever seen a horse up close. I told her I had. I told her about the summer. Ron and I had rented a little cabin in East Tennessee when our son was young, and the neighboring farm had horses, and our boy had been terrified of them for the first 2 days, and then cried when we had to leave because he didn't want to say goodbye to the one he'd named Copper. Sadie laughed. Then she asked, out of nowhere the way children do, if I was sad. Children ask things directly in a way most adults have long since learned not to. "A little," I said, "but less now than I was this morning." Joyce looked at me across her kitchen table with the steady gaze of a woman who has seen people at their worst and knows how to be present without requiring explanation. She said, "You're welcome here anytime, Roberta. You know that." I did know it. I had known it for a while. I just hadn't let myself act on it. I walked home with my empty hands and the cold in my face, and for the first time in longer than I could say, I did not feel like I was waiting for something. I had spent so many years of the last decade waiting. For visits that grew shorter each time. For calls that came less often. For my grandchildren to run to me the way they did when they were small. Waiting at a table that kept moving further away. I wasn't waiting anymore. My son called the second week of December. I was in the garden, which probably sounds strange for December in Tennessee. But there's always something to do. Trimming back the spent perennials, turning the compost, doing the things that prepare the ground for what comes next. My phone was in my coat pocket and I felt it buzz. I looked at his name on the screen. I put the phone back in my pocket and kept working. He called twice more that afternoon. That evening, a text came through. Mom, hope everything's okay. We heard about the piano lesson stopping. Can you call me when you get a chance? I put the phone on the charger and went to bed. 2 days later, Mom, please call me. Something's come up with the accounts. I think there might have been some kind of mix-up. I just want to understand what's going on. No mix-up. That much was clear. The piano lessons had been invisible until they disappeared, the same way I had been invisible until I stopped showing up. And now he was noticing. Not me, exactly. The absence of what I provided. There is a difference, even if he couldn't see it yet. I thought about calling him back. I sat with the phone in my hand on more than one occasion and turned the idea over. I thought about what I would say. That I loved him. That I had always loved him. That loving someone and allowing them to take you for granted are two different things, and I had confused them for too many years. That I was 64 years old and I had one life left to live, and I was going to stop spending it, proving I deserved a seat at someone else's table. I did not call him back. I called Joyce instead and asked if she and Sadie wanted to come over for soup. They came on a Friday evening and Sadie wore her hair in 2 braids and announced when she walked in the door that she had been thinking about banana bread all week. I had made a pot of chicken and wild rice, and we ate at my kitchen table. The same table where I had signed that check 9 years ago. The same table where Ron and I had eaten 10,000 ordinary dinners, and it felt for the first time in a long time like a table that was full. After Sadie had eaten and gone to investigate my bookshelves with the focused intensity of a child on a mission, Joyce leaned across the table and said quietly, "Are you doing okay, really?" I thought about it. Really? I think I'm doing better than I have in a while, I said. It just took a hard month to get here. She nodded. She didn't ask for details, and I didn't offer them. And that was its own kind of kindness. To be seen without being made to explain yourself. Sadie pulled a picture book from my shelf. An old one I think had been my son's as a child, a worn copy with a bear on the cover, and brought it over and climbed into the chair beside me without asking. "Can you read this?" she said. I opened the book. The pages were soft with age. I read it to her in the warm kitchen light while the soup cooled in its pot, and Joyce sat across from us with her hands wrapped around her mug, and the quiet that filled the house was not the pressing, airless quiet I had been living in for months. It was the other kind. The kind that means the room is full. I slept well that night for the first time in a long time. I don't know what happens next with my son. That's the honest truth of it. He may work through his confusion and his hurt, and we may eventually find our way to a real conversation. Not the polite, choreographed exchanges we'd been having for years, but an actual one. Or he may not. I can hold both possibilities now without needing to manage them. What I know is this. I am not waiting by the phone. I am not counting the days since his last call. I am not rehearsing what I'll say when he finally comes around. I have unpacked myself from that particular form of hope. The desperate, exhausting kind that keeps you small. Ron used to say that the people who love you well will find you. You don't have to stand in the middle of the road waving your arms. I think I finally believe him. The Literacy Foundation sent me a letter last week, thanking me for the update to my estate plan. They were gracious and appropriately formal, but tucked in with the letter was a small photograph, a group of children sitting in a circle at the library's summer reading program, every one of them holding a book, every one of them looking at something just out of frame. Looking, it seemed to me, at someone reading to them. I pinned that photograph to the corkboard in my kitchen, right next to the drawing Sadie left for me after dinner on Friday. Crayon, green and brown, a little lopsided. A horse with a long mane, and Miss Roberta written carefully at the top in her just learning handwriting. I stood in front of my corkboard this morning with my coffee, looking at those two things side by side, and I thought, this is what it looks like when the love you have actually lands somewhere. This is what it feels like to finally be seen. And if you've ever sat at a table that was set for people who didn't come, if you've ever carried the food in and cleaned up alone and driven home, wondering what you did wrong, I want you to know something. You did not do anything wrong. You were just giving to the wrong people. There are others out there. They're closer than you think. Sometimes they live 3 houses down, and they answer the door in mismatched socks, and they say your name like it means something. Go find them, or let them find you. Either way, don't wait any longer.